Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Moving on to the next verse in Hebrews chapter 11. This passage is in a way similar and parallel to last week's passage in that we're not talking about the faith of an individual. We're talking about the faith of a whole group, the Israelites as a whole. And of course, this is the Jericho passage. So like last week, we're actually going to go back into the passage that in Joshua, and we're going to just be hitting a few highlights, but we want to set the stage for what the passage in Hebrews talks about. But in the same sort of way, even though, just like with the parting of the Red Sea, that was a very important, powerful, miraculous event, but what the author of Hebrews focused on was the faith of the people, that they were in a place to make a choice to believe God and move forward between those two walls of water or not, and go back to their life in Egypt. They had a choice to make. And so even though it was a miracle of God to part the Red Sea, it was the faith of the people that essentially enabled them to survive by following God's path that He created for them through the sea. Well, in a similar way here, it is obviously a very famous, miraculous event that happened, but it was the faith of the people to believe what God and what Joshua told them was going to happen that enabled this event to happen, because it was God's response to their faith and their belief. So I'm actually going to read the passage in Hebrews last. We're going to start actually in Joshua. Now, just to sort of set the stage from where we were last week, obviously in Exodus, in the first 5 chapters of Joshua, where we are, this is of course after the death of Moses, and God has picked Joshua to be the new leader of the people. So they have, in chapters 1 to 3 of Joshua, under the leadership of Joshua, the people of God pass into Canaan, just as God had promised. And it's kind of interesting. So often we focus so much on that miracle of the parting of the Red Sea. I think sometimes people forget that it happened again here with the River Jordan, because they came up to the River Jordan, and God essentially parted the waters of the river so that they could pass into Canaan as well. I think it's one of those miracles that doesn't get as much attention, but in its own way is just as fascinating. In this case, rather than like with Moses holding up his staff, in this case the priests were carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and when they stepped into the river, it basically the upstream stopped flowing downstream, and it was like it was an invisible dam, and then the waters downstream got out of the way, and then they walked across on dry land. And the priest carrying the ark had to stand there in the middle, and that's kind of what held the water back. And then they brought 12 stones out of the river bed, one representing each of the tribes, and built a memorial on the bank to remember that. And then when all the people had passed over, then the priest came out and the waters returned to their normal flow. The reason that that's important is because obviously that was not something that went unnoticed. We're told in the beginning of chapter 5 that the various kings of the various cities and countries in Canaan were aware that the people of Israel had come and crossed the Jordan and come into the land. It's not like they snuck in the middle of the night with nobody noticing. 1 million people coming across the river is not going to be unnoticed. And it caused a great deal of fear, obviously. I mean, I guess they were concerned about border security too. All these illegal aliens coming in, So they were. A lot of the nations were very afraid, and of course Jericho was the city that was kind of first in line, and I'm sure they definitely were very nervous. But then once they got over the Jordan and they started their encampment there before they hit Jericho, basically 2 important things happened. First of all, they had, all of the adults that had, if you remember, that had come out of Egypt, once they got into the desert, all of the males were circumcised. But this was 40 years later, and as you know, all of the adult age people that came out of Egypt, except for Joshua and Caleb, all died in the wilderness. And so this population, other than Joshua, was essentially the ones who were only children when they left Egypt or were born in the wilderness. And so none of them had been circumcised. So they had a big circumcision party, I guess. What a day that was. And I got up to date on all that. So that and it was just important because that was the sign of God's covenant on the people. So it was important going into the land that be done. So they did it. And then right after that, they celebrated Passover. What's interesting is that after they celebrated Passover, that was when the manna stopped. Because now they were eating of the produce of the promised land, and the manna stopped when they had that last Passover. And so that's kind of setting the stage for where they are, encamped, now in the promised land, but right near Jericho. So Joshua meets someone very special in chapter 5, in verses 10 through 15. We already talked about that part, so I'm going to skip down to verse 13. Now when Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" So Joshua, obviously no doubt startled by seeing a man standing there with a drawn sword, but at the same time perhaps not, maybe startled but not surprised, because remember, they passed into the land and it was not unnoticed. There were kings and cities that were aware of their passing. And so I'm sure at first Joshua may have thought, well, maybe this is a spy from one of the cities, a scout going out to assess whether the people of Israel camping there were a threat. So it might not have been that unusual to see a soldier from one of the local kingdoms coming up to scout out the camp. But at the same time, you notice he asked him, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" Because if he had been a scout of the enemy, you don't normally, when you're reconnoitering like that, you don't normally just walk right up in the open with your sword drawn. That's just a good way to get your head chopped off. Usually that's something you do by stealth at night, and sneak around and kind of observe from a distance or make sure nobody sees you so you can see what's going on with who you're scouting out. And then you can return, to your superior officer and report what you've seen. This guy just walks up openly. So perhaps he might, and I'm speculating, but asking that question, perhaps he might have thought this man was a defector, someone who didn't want to fight against the Israelites and maybe was coming to join their fight and change sides or something. But whatever, he said, you got to declare yourself. Are you for me or are you against me? And so, in verse 14, the reply, interestingly, "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Now, this word that in the NIV anyway is translated commander, technically accurate, but I really like the way the King James Version translates it better. It translates the word as captain. That's actually more accurate because what the Hebrew word really means there is in any rank structure, this is the chief of that rank structure. We might even say a general or even a commander-in-chief, but in those days the word captain of an army basically represented the highest rank in that army. So we're not talking about just a mid-range commanding officer here. He is saying he is essentially the commander-in-chief, not just of an army, but of the Lord's army. So so saying that he is the captain of the Lord's army, clearly this is not an ordinary man. At the very least, this man, as he's originally described, has to be someone very high-ranking, an archangel or something like that, the captain of the host of the Lord. However, it says there in the second part of verse 14, then Joshua fell face down to the ground in reverence and asked him, what message does my Lord have for his servant? Now again, I don't really love that word translated reverence. It's actually in Hebrew, it is the word worship. It says he actually went down on his face on the ground worshiping this being and said, what message does my Lord have for his servant? So because of that, and because of the language that happens right after this, most theologians believe this is not just an ordinary angel, if you can say an angel's ordinary, not even an archangel like Michael or Gabriel. This is most likely what theologians call a theophany, which is a physical manifestation, a visible manifestation of God himself. Or some have suggested a Christophany, which is a pre-incarnate appearance of Christ himself. Either way, this is not just an ordinary angel. This is a physical manifestation, a physical appearance in human form of God himself. Because when he worships this angel, the angel or this being, the being accepts his worship. Angels do not accept worship. Whenever someone has tried to worship an angel, they always say, no, do not worship me. I'm not God. And the commander of the Lord's army replied, verse 15, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy. The place where an angel is standing is not holy because of an angel standing there. There have been many times when there have been an angel present that angel has not said that. And in fact, this is, as you will remember, almost exactly the same wording that God used to Moses when he appeared to him at the burning bush. Only the presence of God makes the ground holy. Mm-hmm. So that's further evidence that this had to be an appearance of God, a theophany or even a Christophany. And of course Joshua did so. He took off his sandals. So beginning in chapter 6, we see Joshua getting his instructions from God himself, from this manifestation, this appearance of God. But what he gives us this little background in the first verse is why the instructions about Jericho are so important. Verse 1 of chapter 6 says, now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. And that's essentially, they were in siege mode. They had seen the Israelites come across, 1 million Israelites camped right outside their city, and they're like, this is not good. Close the gates, lock it all up. We're in siege mode, essentially. But they were very strong, high, impenetrable by normal human means walls. So the city was tightly shut up. And another thing, it was important that this city be taken because it was basically between the Israelites and the rest of Canaan. In order to pass through and occupy the land, they had to be able to defeat this city of Jericho. So in verse 2, then the Lord said to Joshua, and here we have more evidence that this appearance, this man, is actually an appearance of God himself, because it didn't say, the angel said, God has told me to tell you, or thus God has said, or anything that indicates he's bringing a message from God. It just says, the Lord said to Joshua. So that's God standing there talking to Joshua. Now this is not the first time, not the only time, that we have seen this kind of theophany in the Scriptures. Most people believe that the angel that Gideon faced was also God himself. So the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." This is a very important verse here for us to understand and for Joshua and the people to understand. Because notice what he said. He doesn't say, you're going to go and fight a battle and you're going to win. What he says to them is, I've already given them to you. I've given you the city already. And the word there means literally it's a gift, to bestow, to give something to somebody. So in other words, Joshua was not going to take Jericho. Jericho was in the hand of God. And he was giving it to the people as a gift. And you'll notice also, I think it's interesting, that the phrase is in the past tense. I've already given it to you. It hasn't happened yet. The walls are still up. The city is still standing. The people haven't even moved out of their camp. But yet, I've already given it to you. That is so important for us to understand when we're talking about what God promises to us. As far as God's concerned, even if in our human sense, the way we experience time, and even though we might not see the promise manifested in a way that we can comprehend it, if God has promised it, it's already in the past tense as far as God's concerned, which is kind of even meaningless when you're talking about God, but because He's outside of time. But you get my point. If God has made the promise, it's done. It's not like, oh, I hope it's going to happen, or anything like that, or maybe it's going to happen. If God has said He's going to do something, it has already happened. It's in the past tense. So even though the taking of the city is in the future for them at that point, as far as God's concerned, it's already happened. And you notice also the whole phrase is kind of in passive voice, meaning it's not that Joshua's going to go win a victory, it's he's going to be the recipient of something that God has done. And it's so important that Joshua understand, because he doesn't want Joshua to be lifted up with pride and think that what's happening or what's going to happen is because of his strength, because of his wisdom as a leader, his tactics, his, of the people's military might. It isn't because of any of that. They are the recipients of something that God is doing. And that way they can keep the proper perspective and the proper thankfulness and remember who it is who is giving them that gift. It's a gift given to them, not something they have manufactured on their own, not something they have accomplished on their own. It's something that God will give them. And so He has already delivered Jericho into their hands. And so He gives them some very peculiar but very specific instructions. Now, we've heard this story all since we were probably kids, so it's very familiar to us, but try to take yourself back to that moment and imagine hearing these instructions for the very first time. What they're supposed to do. Verse 3 says, "March around the city once with all the armed men, and do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing their trumpets. And when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout." Now that has to seem like, what good is this going to do? I mean, it might have made sense to them for him to say, go get a battering ram and go up to the gates and use the battering ram against the gates, or take huge ladders up to the wall and scale the walls. All the kind of things that you would imagine would be the way that you would fight a city that's walled in and is under siege. All the things that would make sense to a human, general or whoever. None of those things. All he wants you to do is just march around the city. He doesn't want them to destroy the walls. He doesn't want them to defeat the army. He doesn't want them to bust the gates. He just wants them to circle the city with the ark and blow your trumpets. And at a particular time, everybody just shout. Now, it's interesting, the word shout there, I mean, that is an accurate translation. It's interesting that the root there in Hebrew means ear splitting. So it doesn't mean just like cheering or something. It's like, just think of a million people, ear splitting. That's what he wants them to do. And he makes a promise here. It's interesting, he spoils the ending for them. Even before it happens, there's no spoiler warning here. He says, when you do that, in verse 5, he says, the wall of the city will collapse. Not that you'll break it down, it'll just collapse in front of you. The barrier will be gone, and the people will go up, every man straight in. So this is the promise that God makes. He says, if you just believe me, and just take the Ark of the Covenant and circle around the city like I told you, blow in your trumpets, and then shout when I tell you to, then the wall will just simply collapse. And so those are the very odd but very specific instructions. Well, Joshua, to his credit, does not argue, like probably Moses would have. Sorry, I'm speculating, maybe not. And so Joshua called the priests, and he tells them to take the Ark of the Covenant, and he did everything that he was instructed. And then down in verse 7, we see him ordering the people to advance, march around the city, with the armed guard going ahead of the Ark. And so he's actually ordering the people to do this part, to do the march around the city. But this is where the people were placed in the position where they like the ones coming out of Egypt, they had to make a decision. Because this did not sound like the plans of a very smart military general to do this. This didn't sound like anything that would make human sense. So the people could have disobeyed Joshua. They could have said, no, we're not going to do that. We're just going to stay here in our camp, because at least we're safe here in our camp. Or we're going to try to find another way to go around the Jericho and maybe sneak around them where they don't notice. We're not going to do this. It just doesn't make any sense. So the people had a choice to make of whether they were going to follow Joshua and follow God, and whether or not to go through with this particular scenario that had been ordered to them. But it said that they did. This had to be very unnerving to the people in Jericho. I mean, can you imagine standing up on the walls, on the inside walls there, watching this happen, in this thing, these people circling? And even though the trumpets were blowing, up until the end, the people were silent. Mm-hmm. When I was reading this, I was reminded of many years ago when, you probably remember this because I think y'all went. Didn't we all go together to that March for Life down in Atlanta? Mm-hmm. Where we started at the Capitol, and this was back in the 90s, I think. Yeah. Anyway, there was a March for Life down in Atlanta, and we marched from the Capitol down, I can't remember which street it was, but I don't know, we marched around in a big circle and came back to the Capitol. And I don't know, it's like 20,000 people marched. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I remember is that it was a silent march. I don't know if you remember that. Mm-hmm. And they had the roads blocked off, obviously, because we were marching down the street, so you didn't hear traffic noise. So we were in downtown Atlanta, and you didn't hear the traffic noise because they had the roads blocked off. It was all these people marching down silent. And you could actually just hear the footsteps on the road of all those thousands of people marching down the road. And it was so powerful, I thought. I remember thinking how powerful that was that we were silent. And it was to represent the silence of the heartbeats of the aborted babies, is what it was to represent. So I thought about that when I was reading this, because all this hundreds of thousands or millions of people, or a million people, circling around the city, and when the trumpets weren't blowing, they were silent, and it was just that marching sound around for 6 days. I mean, that had to be very scary and unnerving to the people living in Jericho. That had to be really weird.
And the sound of the horns.
Huh?
And the sound of the
And then the sound of the horns.
Can you imagine the cacophony on day 7 though?
I know. And so that's kind of where we get to in verse 12. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and the rear guard followed the ark of the Lord while the trumpets kept sounding. And the second day they marched around the city once, returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, they got up at daybreak and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except on that day they circled the city 7 times. And then in verse 16, the 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." And can you imagine hearing that shout? That ear-splitting scream of 1 million people. That must have been something to hear. So when the trumpet sounded, the people shouted. Verse 20, when the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and at the sound of the trumpet, when the people gave the loud shout, the wall collapsed. So every man charged straight in, and they took the city. So the people even though it didn't make human sense, and even though it didn't seem like the necessarily the smart thing to do militarily, they all believed God's promise that if they did that the wall would collapse. And that's exactly what happened, and now the wall collapsed, and the city was theirs to take. And down in verse 21, it says that they devoted the city to the Lord. God had given specific instructions to avoid what he called the accursed thing. It's not really named, but it's probably some kind of pagan altar or image or something like that, or idol or something, because it said taking that would curse the camp of Israel. So stay away from that thing. But all the other gold and silver and brass and everything, they were to plunder and take into the treasury, into the Lord's treasury. And of course they also pretty much killed everybody in the city. That's what it says.
Yep.
So, and I know that I've sort of skipped over the part about Rahab, and that's only because her story is next week's. So I'm going to come back to that. So I'm skipping over the whole Rahab thing. But they went in and plundered the city. So seeing then the actual event, that takes us to the one little verse, in Hebrews 11:30, where he simply says, "By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days." And so once again, he's saying this in a passive way, in the sense that it wasn't that the people destroyed the walls of Jericho. It wasn't that the people burst through the walls of Jericho. And it didn't say that there were any kind of like natural disasters, like an earthquake or anything like that. None of that. The walls collapsed because of the faith of the people. Because they believed what God said. God said, if you will follow my instructions and march around the city with your trumpets and shout when I say, the walls will simply collapse. They believed God, and they did what he said, and God fulfilled his promise. The walls fell because of the faith of the people. Because if the people hadn't done that, God wouldn't have collapsed the wall. And so yes, they were obedient to God, but their obedience was an act of faith. Because first they had to believe that what God said would happen would happen. So they believed God, and as a result of that, the walls collapsed. So it was not the trumpets, it was not the shouting, it was the faith of the people that collapsed the walls of Jericho. So,
and God even gave them encouragement when he stopped the Jordan, because most of those people had not seen the Red Sea parted. So he even gave them, bolstered their faith. before they got there.
By giving them that miracle.
And because it was the priests who set foot into the Jordan, it was like, by God's power alone, this is happening.
Yes. And I think that's why it's important that they were taking the Ark of the Covenant with them as they marched around, because that was emphasizing, and I probably should have said that was emphasizing the presence and the power of God was the one doing it, not among the people. And it was the fact that the Ark was among the people, demonstrating their faith in Him. Both of those things. So that was a very important part of it, because the Ark represented His presence amongst the people and His power.